Parshas Acharei Mot and Kedoshim, which is the double parsha, poses one of the greatest difficulties. The last chapter of Acharei Mot and the last chapter of Kedoshim are repetitions of one another. The same thing is repeated twice. The laws of incest, the laws of arayas. The last chapter of Parshas Acharei Mot talks about the prohibitions. You can't marry your mother, you can't marry your sister, you can't marry your daughter, not your daughter-in-law, and so on and so forth. It lists the prohibitions. The last chapter of Parshas Kedoshim lists the penalties. That if you commit incest with these family members, you're liable for the death penalty, this form of death penalty, that form of death penalty. In certain instances, there is no death penalty, it's merely the heavenly punishment of Acharei. Why are these laws split in two chapters? And again, there's material that's in between. The whole first half of Parshas Kedoshim intervenes, which is a potpourri of assorted laws. So why is it that the laws of the arayas are split into two chapters? Very, very, very difficult problem. The truth is this, that each of these two parshias has a concluding section. And if you look at the two concluding sections, you will see that they are different. Meaning the thematic rationale for the laws in Parshas Acharei Mot is very different than the thematic rationale for the laws in Parshas Kedoshim. And this is something which you have to read very, very carefully. So if you have the Chumash in front of you, and you turn to page 654. Let's see what the Torah says in the end of Acharei Mot. I'll read the Hebrew. Al titamu b'chol eila. Do not become defiled or contaminated through any of these offenses. Meaning, if a person commits incest, this entails tumah. This entails a certain defilement, a certain contamination, and a person should not become defiled through performing one of these acts. Because it was through these acts that the nations which I am sending out of Eretz Yisrael were defiled. In other words, these practices, these forms of incest, were practiced by the nations that were the native occupants of Eretz Yisrael. These are the nations that are being driven out to allow the Jews to enter, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amori, so on and so forth. So you don't defile yourself, because the nations that previously occupied Eretz Yisrael, they were defiled by these practices. Vatit ma'aretz, and the land became defiled. Vo'efkod avoina oleha, and I recalled its sin upon it. Vataki ha'aretz es yoshveha, and the land, it vomited out its inhabitants. Now this is an amazing thing. You see, we read Jewish history, and we think that Yeshua came in, and he conquered the land. He took the land away from the various native countries. Says that's only the way it appears to the casual observer. In reality, the reason the nations were driven out, the Torah says, is because the land expelled them. The land expelled them. Because they had defiled themselves, the land expelled them. And the Torah goes on and says, you should guard my laws, my statutes. Don't perform any of these abominations, so as both the native born and converts among you. Because all of these abominations were performed by the people that came before you. The land should not vomit you out when you defile it. Kasher Ka Es Goya Shalifnechem, as it vomited out the nations that came before you. Now, you read the entire section, we get the following impression. So what happened was like this. There were 7 nations that occupied Eretz Yisrael. These nations defiled themselves by practicing incest and these abominations. In turn, they defiled the land. What was the consequence? The land expelled them. And the image we get is that Eretz Yisrael is not a piece of rock. It isn't something which is inanimate. But Eretz Yisrael also is a living quality. So in the same way that if you eat something which is spoiled, your body won't hold it, because your body will become upset, and ultimately you will disgorge the spoiled food. So Eretz Yisrael also, it expels people that defile the land. Eretz Yisrael will not tolerate defilements. So the nations which lived in Eretz Yisrael, they defiled themselves. In turn, they defiled the land. Eretz Yisrael expelled them. That's really what happened. It wasn't that Yeshua conquered them. Yeshua was able to conquer them because the land expelled them. And now there's a cautionary warning that don't do the same. Now you're coming into Eretz Yisrael. You're in the exact same situation. If you commit these sins, you will in turn defile the land, and you'll also be vomited out. So stand forewarned that observe the law, do the right thing, or else you will meet the same fate as the previous nations met. That's simple as that. In other words, there is no fundamental difference here between Jew and Gentile. In other words, the arayas, incest, and these immoral acts are not Jewish things per se. Chazal say that b'nei Noach are mitzuv al arayas. Even Gentiles are obligated to observe these laws. These aren't Jewish things per se. The Gentiles were expelled from Eretz Yisrael for committing these acts. Jews are liable for the same thing. They can meet the same fate. So therefore, what happened to the Gentiles should serve as a warning that we should also observe these laws. But there is nothing Jewish about these laws per se that is conveyed in Parshas Acharei Mot. Because we are not told that we have to observe these laws because we are meant to be better than the Gentiles. That's not what the Torah is telling us. The Torah says that this is something which, in theory, applies to all mankind. From the Gentiles, we are learning a warning. It says they failed to observe these laws, and therefore they were vomited out. If you fail to observe these laws, the same thing will happen to you. So smell the coffee. Figure out that you don't want to meet the same fate that they met. So this is what happened to them. If you violate these laws, this can happen to you. So be careful. Don't do the same thing that they did.
Is this a penalty only for living in Eretz Yisrael?
And the Ramban speaks this out. Ramban says over here that the truth is the laws of Arayas don't only apply in Eretz Yisrael. The laws of Arayas are not among the mitzvahs hatluyas ba'aretz. These aren't mitzvahs that are specific to Eretz Yisrael. You have to practice the laws of Arayas everywhere. But the warning here is that Eretz Yisrael is special. In other words, if you violate the Arayas in Eretz Yisrael, there's a special risk because the land won't tolerate it. I'll just mention, by the way, an interesting thing that this really echoes. Ramban himself draws the analogy to something we find way back in Chumash in Parshas Vayera. We read the story of the destruction of Sodom. The city of Sodom was destroyed. So we think Sodom must have been the worst place on the earth. Must have been terrible, Sodom, that God should destroy the entire city for their cruelty and their sins. Terrible. The Ramban says no. Sodom was not necessarily the worst place on earth. There may have been other places that were just as bad as Sodom. There's no reason to assume Sodom was the worst place on earth. But Sodom was in Eretz Yisrael. The Ramban says. That's how it was destroyed. It was destroyed because Eretz Yisrael will not tolerate a place like Sodom. In other words, if Sodom would have been outside of Eretz Yisrael, it wouldn't have been destroyed. It wouldn't have been destroyed. It wasn't destroyed because it was the absolute worst, most sinful population on earth. It was destroyed because it was in Eretz Yisrael. You can't be like stone and live in Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael won't tolerate that. So therefore the city of stone was destroyed.
But there is tolerance for a certain period of time.
Pardon?
There is tolerance for a certain period of time.
God gives everyone a chance to do tshuva, to repent, right? But once you reach the point of no return, that's it. But that's what the Ramban says, that stone was destroyed because it was in Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael won't tolerate that type of conduct. Whatever the sin of stone was, cruelty and lack of charity, whatever it was, whatever the sin was, it was not the worst place on earth. There would have been other places, perhaps outside of Eretz Yisrael, that were just as bad, maybe even worse. But stone was in Eretz Yisrael. It was the worst place in Eretz Yisrael. That couldn't be tolerated. And the Ramban applies the same idea over here. Of course, the arayas are applied around the world. I mean, think about it for a second. These nations, the Canaanim and the Chitim and the Amorim, they were driven out of Eretz Yisrael. Where did they go? Somewhere else. You think they repented? Whatever they did in Eretz Yisrael, they probably continued to do outside of Eretz Yisrael. No, so why were they driven out again and again and again and again and again and again? The answer is they were driven out of Eretz Yisrael. But now that they were firmly ensconced in some place outside of Eretz Yisrael, there they could stay. There could stay. We have no reason to believe they repented. They were expelled from Eretz Yisrael because of these specific sins. So they were driven out of Eretz Yisrael. Wherever they found themselves, they probably continued doing those sins. But outside of Eretz Yisrael, you can stay. Right? It's the sanctity, the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. It doesn't tolerate tumah. It's like a stomach which won't tolerate rotten food. Okay? But the point of Parshas Acharei Mot has nothing to do with the difference between a Jew and a Gentile or the special mission of a Jew. Nothing to do with it. Right? It's all about Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael won't tolerate certain things. It won't tolerate them if Gentiles do them. It won't tolerate them if Jews do them. There's no difference. So therefore, we only mention the 7 nations, the Gentiles, as a warning. That the land expelled them, the land will expel you. Turn to Parshas Kedoshim. The end of Parshas Kedoshim, there's a different point that's made over here. This is page 670. Again, the concluding section. Ushmartem es kol chukosai ves kol mishpatai v'asisim osam. You should observe all my laws. Again, v'lo soki eschem ha'aretz. The land should not expel you. Okay, so far, nothing new. But it continues. Don't follow the statutes of the nations which I send out. Because they did all these things, and I was disgusted by them. And I said to you, you shall inherit their land. And I will give it to you as an inheritance. Ani Hashem Elokeichem, I am Hashem your God, Asher Hivdalti Eschem min ha'amim, who separated you from the nations. And if you go ahead a little bit, V'yisim li Kedoshim, you shall be holy, Ki Kadosh Ani Hashem, for I am holy. V'adl Eschem min ha'amim li Yosli, I separated you from the nations to be mine. Here, there is something else introduced, which is the idea that God rejected the nations, and he selected us, and therefore to be deserving of that selection, we have to observe these laws. Here there's something new. Here there's the selection of the Jews from among all the nations of the world, which is emphasized. This is not emphasized in Parashas Acharei Mot. In Acharei Mot, there's no distinction between Jew and Gentile. It's simply the question that Eretz Yisrael won't tolerate anybody who commits the arayas, Jew or Gentile. Here it's something else. Here it's, God says, don't do what they do, because I have chosen you to be different, and therefore acting like them undermines the justification for that selection. Let's understand exactly what we're talking about. if you go back hours late, if you go back in Parshas Acharei Mot, there is no mention of the concept of Kedusha. There is no mention of the concept of Kedusha. There is the concept of Tumah. There is the concept of defilement. There is no mention of the concept of Kedusha with regards to the laws of the Arayas. Here, in this conclusion, it says, V'yisam li Kedoshim, you shall be holy, ki Kodesh ani Hashem, for I am holy. The truth is that that's what Parshas Kedoshim is all about. Parshas Kedoshim introduces the concept of Kedusha. Kedusha. Kedoshim to you, you shall be holy people. And concludes with the idea of holiness. Until Parshas Kedoshim, we never speak about Kedusha as being a Jewish ideal. We only speak about avoiding tumah, avoiding impurity. Now, just to illustrate the point, go back to Parshas Shmini. In Parshas Shmini, where the sons of Aaron, the surviving sons of Aaron, page 594, are told not to drink wine. So he says, the reason you have to remain sober is lahavdil bein hakodesh ubein hachol, to differentiate between holy and profane, ubein hatamei ubein hatar, and between impure and pure. There are two different divisions. There is a division between kodesh and chol, holy and mundane, and tamei and tahar. These are two separate pairs of categories. How do we understand that? So let me perhaps bring it out this way. The Ramban says in Parshas Hazinu that God's original plan for creation was not that there should be a distinction between and among different subsets of humanity. It wasn't meant to be that there would be a chosen people and everyone else would be not chosen. All mankind, the entire human race, was meant to be equal in God's scheme. That was the original plan. The human race as a whole failed. It failed in the Garden of Eden. It failed at the Tower of Babel. It failed the generation of the flood. And therefore, at a certain point, God activated Plan B, which was to select a subset of humanity, the Jewish people, Avraham Avinu and his descendants, to bring all mankind to truth and morality, and so on and so forth. That chosen people is devoted to a higher purpose. It's a higher mission. It is a mission which transcends the rest of humanity. Right? There are certain expectations of all human beings, but God has higher expectations of the Jewish people. That's the essence of Kedusha. Kedusha. Kedusha means something which is devoted to a higher purpose. An animal is chayil. An animal is mundane. If you are magdish the animal, if you dedicate the animal to be a sacrifice in the Beis HaMikdash, it becomes kodesh, it becomes holy. It is designated for a higher function. Other animals are meant to eat grass and give milk and give wool and pull a plow. And this bull is designated for a higher function. It is meant to be used as a tool for coming closer to the Ribono Shel Olam through its sacrifice. That's what kadosh means. Kadosh means it's designated for a higher purpose. There's nothing wrong with a cow that gives milk. Nothing wrong with it. It's chayil. Chayil is not to belittle something, to say that it's chayil. It's just not holy. It's not dedicated for a higher purpose. It's dedicated to its regular purpose. You know, there's nothing wrong with Wednesday. Nothing wrong with Monday. But it's chayil. Right? Monday is a perfectly legitimate day. Wednesday, Thursday. Shabbos is kodesh. Right? Shabbos is dedicated to a higher purpose. We act differently. We live differently. We exist in a higher plane. So Shabbos is kodesh. Chayil is only negative by comparison. There's nothing wrong with being chayil. Tamei is polluted. Tameh is contaminated. It's something which is debased, it's degraded. That's what it means for something to be tameh. The nations of the world, ideally, are choil, but they should be tahor. Right? We don't expect them to be devoted to a higher purpose. We don't expect kedusha of them, but we expect that they should be tahor. They should be pure. They shouldn't be defiled. They shouldn't be contaminated. So the Torah tells us in Parshas Acharei Mot that the nations of the world, they corrupted themselves. They debased themselves. They debased themselves through the practice of incest. Now, just as an aside, why does incest debase our fundamental humanity? What's wrong with incest? This is something which is very important to understand. You know, there's a taboo against incest. We all find incest abhorrent. But that taboo, apparently, was not universal to all societies. It says that the Canaanim practiced incest, the Egyptians practiced incest. So this taboo undoubtedly is a consequence of the fact that our society, Judeo-Christian society, legislated against it, and this ban has been reinforced generation after generation after generation after generation, to the point that there's a cultural taboo against incest. What's wrong with incest? What's the problem? Why is incest objectionable? You can make a very strong case that if a brother would marry a sister, he'd never have any in-law problems. Right? So why not? What's wrong with it? So the answer is very simple, I believe. The answer is that where close relatives were seen as possible sexual partners, the very concept of the family would break down. In other words, the trust, the type of concern, which is the cornerstone of the family, could not exist if a daughter had to be worried that her father had interest in her, or if a son had to think that his mother had interest in her, or vice versa. In other words, in order for the family relationships to be what they are meant to be, parents to children, children to parents, uncles to nieces and nephews, aunts to nieces and nephews, and vice versa, it means there has to be a very strong sense that this is not a person with whom I can have a sexual relationship. And that's really, I think, the idea which underlies Darchei. And of course, we know that the family, right, is the setting which is, through which you have the most fundamental transmission of values. Not only for Jews, for all cultures. Because cultures perpetuate, societies perpetuate their values within the framework of the family. When the family breaks down, the transmission of values breaks down. We all understand that. And that's why we have to lament the current breakdown of the family as we witness it in our own time, in various segments of the North American population, because it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. Or the values that make a society strong, the traditions, the devotion to concern for one another and hard work and moral values, all collapse with the breakdown of the family. So therefore, if you practice Darchei, if you practice incest with the associated breakdown of the family, you've become debased, you've become degraded as a human being. That's what it means to be tameh. Tameh doesn't mean that you no longer are devoted to a higher spiritual purpose. To be tameh means you're degraded, you're debased, you're corrupted, you're defiled. And that is something which the Torah expects, not only of Jews, of Gentiles as well. So therefore, in Parshas Acharei Mot, where the emphasis is on the issue of Tumah, we haven't yet introduced the idea of Kedoshim to you. There the Torah tells us a very simple thing, that the Gentiles practiced these things. As a consequence, they became defiled. As a consequence, they defiled the land. Eretz Yisrael didn't tolerate that and expelled them. So here's a cautionary warning, that you stand to be in the same situation. If you do these things, you'll become defiled, and you'll defile the land, and Eretz Yisrael will expel you. It's not a question of you being any better than them, right? It says you're meant to be the same. They've already failed. You haven't yet failed. So take their experience as a warning. That's all Acharei Mot tells us, right? Which makes perfect sense. Parshas Kedoshim introduces something new. It introduces the idea of Kedoshim Tiyu Kikodesh Ani. This already is something higher. This is the higher expectation God has of the Jewish people. That for the Jew, it's not enough just not to be tamei, not to defile himself. That's enough for the Gentile, not to defile himself. For the Jew, it's not enough not to be tamei. For the Jew, he has to be devoted to a higher purpose. He has to be kadosh. He has to be holy, because he is chosen. He is chosen for a higher calling. Right? And therefore, the practice of the arayos not only is a violation of that which is expected of all human beings, it's also a violation of your unique Jewish mission. It's a violation of the imperative of Kedusha. And this is what God says. God says, listen, says, the nations of the world were rejected because of this. It says, you were chosen because I had confidence in you that you could be better, you could be higher, you could be loftier. So live up to that. But that's what Parshas Kedoshim talks about. And finally it says that you should be holy, V'yisem Kedoshim. You have to be holy. And that is only what is introduced in Parshas Kedoshim. I'll read you the exact words. V'yisem li Kedoshim, you should be holy unto me. Ki Kodesh ani Hashem, for I am holy. And I've separated you from the nations to be for me. It raises the concern of arayos to a higher plane. It now is not something which is common to all the nations of the world. It's something which is specifically Jewish. It's specifically Jewish. Now the truth is, now we understand why the punishments are placed in Parshas Kedoshim and the warnings are in Parshas Acharei Mot. Because the truth is this. The truth is that the Gentiles have the same prohibitions that we have. But the punishments are different. For example, the punishment of kares, which means two things. It means premature death at the hands of heaven. And it also means that the soul is cut off from the experience of the world to come, is certainly something which is specific to Jews. It is not something which is applicable to Gentiles. There is no concept of kares for the Gentile. This is a Jewish concept. But even the forms of death penalty, the Gemara says that B'nai Nayach, when they are liable for the death penalty, which they are liable for, it is always the death penalty of sayif. It is always the death penalty of the sword, decapitation. Right? The death penalties that Jews are subject to, whether they be skila, sreifa, stoning, burning, or chenek, strangulation, which are the punishments for the arayos, are penalties which are specific to Jews. That's why they are introduced in Parshas Kedoshim. Parshas Kedoshim is the parsha of arayos that relates to us as Jews, and therefore it introduces concepts which are specific to Jews, meaning the idea of kares and the idea of the forms of death penalty, which are not applicable to the Gentile. But what it means all in all is this, that in the arayos there are two concepts implicit. One is that the practice of the arayos itself is corrupting to us as human beings. As we talked about, the breakdown of the family, there can be all sorts of aspects to this. Now, you might talk about how it corrupts the gene pool and introduces, inbreeding produces birth defects. I mean, there are all sorts of rationalizations you can have for the incest taboo. It has nothing to do, per se, with being Jewish. And in Eretz Yisrael, it's especially not to be tolerated. It makes no difference who in Eretz Yisrael practices it, whether it's a Gentile, whether it's a Jew. Eretz Yisrael will not bear that type of defilement and stand forewarned. In Parshas Kedoshim, we're raising the stakes. There is something very specifically Jewish, that it is a violation of our higher function. Our higher function of being holy means that we have to rise above the temptation to commit these things. And, there are many aspects to this, right? For a Gentile, as long as he doesn't practice incest, he's in compliance with the law, right? For a Jew, the laws of the Arayos are only the starting point. It's only the starting point. But from the Arayos, he's meant to understand, okay, that this entire area of life has to be something which is infused with sanctity, with holiness. It has to be something which is led and conducted on a higher plane, right? That's what Parshas Kedoshim introduces, the idea of Kedusha, the idea of holiness. And that's why the two Parshas are separate, because they're two different themes. Acharei Mot is the question, keep away from Tumah, keep away from the debasement, which is really applicable to all human beings. Kedosha means that we have to live on a higher plane as a Jew. The Arayos is a violation of both. It's a corruption of our fundamental humanity. It's also a failure to live at the higher standard which is expected of every Jew. Okay, everyone have a great week. Bez Hashem, we will begin next week.